Hi friends, my name's host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People and the world's premier typologist. And earlier I made a video saying I thought Jordan Peterson was probably an ENTJ. And I said in the description, but I forgot to mention in the video, that I would qualify that by saying as a second choice. I normally don't give second choices, but I'm a little divided here on him. He might be an ENFJ. The key thing being that he's very likely to be SI polar, based on the cues we have, the data we have, since we can't type them directly, etc. Right? But this video isn't about that. It's about some of the comments that Jordan Peterson videos elicit. And I get that he has a lot of fans and that he's sort of correct about plenty of things. But what always strikes me is people seem to be under the misapprehension that he's smart. Jordan Peterson is not smart in any meaningful sense of the word. And in order to clarify why I say this, I realize, of course, I need to provide some is someone smart tests that people can apply here so they can determine whether actually somebody's smart or they're just getting smoke blown up their ass. Okay, so the first thing you need to check on if someone's smart is how nuanced is their frame projection. So I have a lot of frame projection. This is an example of it, right? I'm telling you, Jordan Peterson isn't smart in the way that I'm smart, right? Because I'm projecting my frame of reference and identifying it as a normative good. I'm dismissing and trying to negate the understandings of smart that include what Jordan Peterson is, okay? But here's how you can use this frame projection thing as a test to test anybody. Anybody who's not able to tell you that is missing a certain prerequisite to being smart. In other words, they've failed to apply their intuition, attention, deliberation, or whatever to themselves in the same fashion that they apply it to other people. And they think they're somehow excluded as an object of analysis. Otherwise, they need to attend to the fact that they're projecting a frame too and what that means, etc., and why they're projecting it. And it's not just because they're right, okay? Everybody thinks they're right, and that's why they're projecting their frame. But of course, that's not actually the case, and it requires some nuanced kind of engagement with this notion and one's own identity to actually be smart. So I don't think Jordan Peterson is aware at how much he's projecting his frame of reference. His whole solvency thing, clean your room, get shit done, it's very TESE, regardless of whether he's an ENTJ or an ENFJ, or even something else. Even if he's not displaying in accordance with his type, we can still point to the fact that he's very unnuanced in how he projects what is important to him as universally the right way. And that's a sure sign of what I would call not smartness, okay? Number 2, nude emperor identification. Now, this is probably why so many people give Jordan Peterson credit for being smart, is that he did successfully publicly and became sort of a poster boy for identifying a particular nude emperor. The thing is, okay, yeah, I get it. He was on the correct side of the question about whether people should be compelled by like the government or some other organization to use pronouns that another person dictates them to use. Now, and he even gave not bad reasons as to why we shouldn't affirm that notion. But he didn't give the correct reasons. But regardless, that was a super easy nude emperor to identify, okay? Most nude emperors are a little more challenging to identify than that for most people because they get locked in. They don't have a cognitive function stack that allows them to be extremely, extremely correct, which requires shit tons of and decades of parsing, not knowing, not intuiting, right? The intuition is there and necessary, but inadequate without a robust, active, introverted thinking kind of calculus. If you're going to identify nude emperors regularly. So we know he's not actually good at nude emperor identification because he operates under an evolutionary psychology frame, even though no matter what you think about evolution, no correct thinking, intelligent, reasonable person can disagree with the following fact. Evolutionary scientists have failed to meet the prima facie burden to make their case, given the nature of their affirmation, which is that they explain speciation and where species come from. So, no, I don't negate evolution because I have some alternate notion. I'm not a creationist or whatever. I negate it. I'm just objectively saying, if you look into it all and you can think it all, it's very obvious that evolution has failed to meet its prima facie burden, and that if it needs to be accepted as a general explanation for things, it's going to have to meet that prima facie burden first, which means it's going to need to define a couple of terms. It's like it cannot meet its burden to define speciation or to explain speciation with it while concurrently refusing to define the word species. I mean, so in Jordan Peterson should be, if he's smart, should be able to recognize that there's nothing there to hang any kind of hat on, and if you try to build explanations out of it, you are blowing smoke out of your ass. Note, a much more challenging new emperor to identify was COVID at the initial thing. I successfully pointed out that the 4% fatality number was going to be an exponential order of exponents lower because of the methodology of data gathering. It was very obvious to me, very clear to anybody who looked, and I was proof correct, and yet most people didn't agree with me because of this challenge people have with identifying new emperors correctly. Did Jordan Peterson agree with me? I don't know. But I do know that he self-identifies as an evolutionary psychologist, despite the fact that the explanation upon which he's predicating his whole shit hasn't even met its prima facie burden yet. If you're a good thinker, you know what I mean, and you understand how shocking and appalling it is that you could have credentials and shit on nothing, on something that doesn't even get out the gate in a real kind of fucking deliberative dialectical analysis. So, okay. But the third one is clothed emperor identification. So what I see in a lot of people who aren't smart, according to me, is they come in and they've bought into hugely speculative, holistic things that emperor has nude, and that emperor is nude, and that most emperors do have clothes on. So it takes a special kind of intellect to genuinely be smart. You have to be a very original, non-linear thinker. You have to have excellent lateral thinking, and you have to be consistently parsing and be relentlessly self-critical in your parsing and have a metaframe to explain it all. Jordan Peterson he does not have those things. He cannot be smart in any meaningful sense of the word. He'd have to sit down and learn from me a shit ton. Then maybe he could be smart. Maybe he could be smarter than me. But that requires actual humility. And remember, actual humility doesn't look like somebody being falsely modest. Actual humility means, wow, I'm empowered to be super confident because I'm actually right, because I actually listen to other people, because I actually get corrected all the time. Not all the time, decreasingly often over the years, right? That's the benefit of being my type. The bad part about being my type is you're stupid for decades, but eventually you've done everything you can that's super stupid, and so you learn, okay, I'm going to excise that. You said every affirmation that hasn't withstood water, and you excised it. You understand which affirmations do. You understand your responsibility to handle the frames. You don't tell people things as advice or universalities without some understanding of how framing works. Reification habits. One of the biggest kinds of clothed emperor over-identification is predicated in, of course, reification, which is just like the most rampant, wanton form of bad thinking in the history of the world. It's the unnamed they. Well, they did this. It's the notion that basically a fundamental attribution bias that assumes that something is more likely to have been done out of malice or purposefully than out of stupidity or incompetence. If you look at how Jordan Peterson has made this straw witch out of so-called postmodernists, which he doesn't define correctly at all, it's insane. It's like there is no they that he's talking about there. There is no group of single-minded ideologues working together to meagity-mea. Okay? That's called NI run amok. That's NI run amok. If you look at any set of data and you change the zoom level, you will at some point find what appears to be a very clear pattern. And you've failed to acknowledge and understand the way that zoom levels and data work. And that's something Jordan Peterson is very frequently guilty of. Okay, let's go down here. We're saving the most damning ones for last. Epistemological balance. What do I mean by epistemological balance? So when we're talking about something like, is Jordan Peterson smart, I am explicitly excluding from this something called emotional intelligence. Is he socially graceful? Maybe. He certainly is very successful at being famous and being known as the face and voice of something. So maybe he's socially graceful, and that is certainly a form of intelligence. Is he deeply aware of what's important to him, what's precious to him, how to avoid regret, how to protect those things that are more important than other things that might be interesting in the moment? That's another kind of hugely important intelligence, okay? And I am explicitly excluding it from this conversation of, is someone smart? I mean smart in the colloquial conventional sense of being a creative, fast thinker who's correct about things and isn't easily fooled, and who's, surfing the curve, who's out on the front lines ideationally with cutting edge philosophy. That makes somebody actually smart, okay? Because otherwise, he's just retooling bullshit and selling it back to you, warmed up and put on a fancy plate. What I mean by epistemological balance, additionally, since I said that's about F's, right, is that I get that my epistemological balance isn't great, okay? But my epistemological balance includes my incorporation of experiential knowledge, particularist knowledge, my own examples, and concretizations that I can link to rules. It includes a equally robust relationship with introverted intuition, that is to say, understanding the nature of things as they are in and of themselves outside of their relationship with me. I have a very strong relationship with introverted thinking, which is to say, parsing out words according to a universal logic that is objective because it's built into the grammar of how we communicate, in order to make sure that whatever claims I'm making withstand scrutiny in a way that Jordan Peterson never does. So, let's look at probably the most important piece of proof that Jordan Peterson is not a smart person. And another reason why some people may mistake him as one. So, here's this meta-rationalism and self-concept thing. So, what is meta-rationalism? Meta-rationalism is the acknowledgement that it's not the smartest thing to be the most rational or objective person. That reality check acknowledges that we ourselves have multiple possible ways to approach a problem, and that we ourselves habitually do it in fewer than those possible ways, and thereby limit ourselves in our understandings in some way. So a meta-rationalist, in some regard, is going to sound like Jordan Peterson, who's both a rationalist, presumably, and a Christian. Now, what's the problem, then, with, doesn't he meet this criteria? Doesn't he qualify then as smart? Well, no, because he's doing it wrong. So, in other words, meta-rationalism doesn't just come into place with faith and stuff, but it also comes into place with self-concept and the understanding of individuals and the understanding of groups. So with Jordan Peterson, and this is the biggest proof we have of all, that he's incredibly not smart, what he's done is he went out and affiliated himself with a team, Krager University, which is a conservative university. Now, I'm not against conservatives. I'm not against liberals. I don't think progressives are the problem. I don't think right-wingers are the problem. I don't think Republicans are the problem. I don't think Democrats are the problem. I think joining teams like that is the problem, mostly. So when Jordan Peterson chooses to join the army against the make-believe villain of the boogeyman postmodernists, it doesn't matter if you're fond of that make-believe villain as a villain. And sure, I mean, it's an easy villain to kick around. And nothing means anything, and I'm never going to apply that critique to my own shit, right? Deconstructionism, according to sort of concretized subjective observations about enfranchisement, is dumb. There's no doubt about that. Those people who are arguing those things are even dumber than Jordan Peterson. That's true. If somebody, it's like, if you can identify a person who's arguing that, we can agree that person is dumber than Jordan Peterson. But to fail to recognize that he is creating a make-believe boogeyman, to demonize and blame, and then trying to tell everybody else that that's the correct thing to do, even though it does not withstand scrutiny in reality at all, that makes him not smart. So let's go to this last thing, self-concept. I've said in a recent stream, I'm very glad I didn't get famous young, because as somebody else said in a recent stream, you stop growing when you become famous. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I do acknowledge that it's better to be old and have a lot of piled up failure and a lot of regular misery from life, before you get any kind of recognition for things on a grand scale. Now, Jordan Peterson would seem to have had that. In other words, he wasn't famous until he was, and he was old by the time he got famous, about my age maybe. I don't really know how old he is, but you can see what happens when you get famous in the absence of a clear self-concept. So he was suddenly finding himself leveling up. He had accustomed himself to fiefdom godhood, which is what any college professor or high school teacher has. They are god of their little fiefdom, and they expect everybody to listen to them and believe what they say, and they have the information, the student needs to get it from them. So he's accustomed to that kind of thing, but it doesn't scale well, especially when you don't actually have correct answers, and it does matter. When you're in school, nothing really matters, because school is where they train people, where society trains people to get accustomed to being dumb. And, that it's fine that we're doing nothing but practice work here at school for over a decade. Practicing for what? We don't need to specify that, So, obviously, being in education is a hurdle, a sort of intellectual hurdle every educator has to overcome. I had to overcome it. I'm a teacher. I was a teacher, classroom teacher. But I overcame it by luck, mostly, which is I had the opportunity to be a debate coach and see that the only way education is anything is when it's zero sum. If in order for my student to get an A, your student has to get a F, now we're talking about education. Now we're actually educating people, because there's a concrete metric to evaluate success. The thing that's being talked about is inherently broadening and educating, namely how one parses ideas, basically, how one speaks and argues, how one justifies, and the various public policy issues that go along with that. And the teacher is no longer god of the fiefdom, because every debater who comes back from a tournament, having tried your failed idea, will tell you about it in no uncertain terms if you're the coach. So you have to operate in a real world. In a real world where suddenly bullshit doesn't count. You have to actually have the right argument. You have to be correct. Sure, you can get by with bullshit sometimes, as Jordan Peterson has learned. He has been elevated to the status of speaker of a generation of a certain mindset and was totally unqualified and unprepared for it, frankly. One thing I've heard from him is supposedly he has this 160 IQ. Whenever anybody talks about their IQ, or when somebody else talks about their IQ, because if somebody else talks about their IQ, they heard it from somewhere, right? If a person is informed about their own IQ number and thinks it's anything other than a complete fucking ridiculous joke, then they are not smart. Why? Because if you wanted to measure IQ, you'd need to measure it with complicated metrics like the ones you see before you here. You couldn't ever possibly dream of measuring intelligence with a standardized test. And if you get a super high score on such a test, then again, that means you are definitely not very smart. Because intelligence doesn't correlate well with doing well on standardized tests. After all, it's too frame challenging. It's too nudity identifying. It's too clothing identifying, and whether or not something is nude or clothed depends a lot of times on whether you can have faith that the person who made the question is intelligent enough to have realized what they actually mean. And a lot of times they're not. So, if you're truly smart, you will almost never encounter a test of anything that's nuanced, that's not closed system, in which you don't have to be a frame manager for the whoever it was who wrote the test, whatever educator or set of educators wrote that test. People, for me, I use language overall more precisely than anybody. Now, it's not true that I use language more precisely than an INTP, you might very well say, and that would be correct. What I mean by I use language more precisely than anybody is you can't write a test question in a way that conveys something other than what you hoped to convey and me miss it. Like, okay, well, what are they trying to say here? They actually said this, but based on various contextual clues, I think they expect us to interpret it like this. Truly smart people have too much of that going on to allow for them to do well on your standardized test. I mean, first of all, they're like I have trouble taking any such thing seriously enough to even want to bother spending the time on it, because it's just validating what's fundamentally a wrong frame of reference to begin with. Intelligence isn't a discrete, measurable quality, and reifying it into one with your pretend make-believe score that it actually says only this. Your number refers to how you perform on this assessment. And that's it. It doesn't link to anything outside of it. It's a circular reasoning kind of bullshit. To the extent that it has any empirical links outside, they're to behaviors or accomplishment correlates, not to anything that anybody could actually call intelligence. So if you're thinking IQ matters, and you think it's important, and I've heard Jordan Peterson say it matters a lot, and it's important, you are not a smart person. And that's all there is to it. Now, this might be offensive to you, and you might not like the fact that I'm telling you you're not a smart person. But what you are is something else. You may be effective. You may be efficient. To be efficient requires you to not be very smart sometimes. You've got to use heuristics. You don't have time to parse everything out. You got to be efficient. To be clear on where you're going and where you should be going and what you should be doing and what others should be doing, you can't be smart. You have to be attending in that way. You have to be attending via goals and stuff. Goals are ordinal. They're about causal ordinalities. Those things don't require intelligence. They require hey, look, I pushed it over and it fell down. And then figuring out what's the best order of operations. That's a great problem-solving thing for people who are trying to solve actual things to attain actual goals that they actually want. But it's not being smart. Smart people are too busy doing shit like this to bother with stuff like that. So let's all agree on one thing, if nothing else. Jordan Peterson is not smart, and it's just the only reason he's become this poster child for intelligence is because of how incredibly stupid almost everybody else is. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.